All right, so we're in Philadelphia in 1787, and Madison is convinced Washington to give it another go. So Washington shows up along with about 53 other people from around the colony, so 55 altogether, there to essentially create a government out of scratch. And the decision was made very early on to keep the proceedings um, shielded from public attention. So they had to seal up the windows and keep people from peeking in and listening to what was going on. So they're in this small wooden building for almost 3.5 months in the middle of the summer in Philadelphia. And if you've ever been to Philadelphia in summer, it's hot and it's swampy. So they stuck it out under these pretty extraordinary conditions. I want to talk about 4 different areas in which they had to make decisions, among many, many others, just to give you a sense of how the debate went, what kinds of things they talked about, and how they came to decisions they arrived at. The first broad area is this conflict that I mentioned before that had emerged between the large and the small states. Under the Articles, if you recall, each state had only one vote, and this was really not acceptable to the large states, who didn't get as much representation per capita as the small states did. But there were enough small states to ensure that it was going to be impossible to get a fully proportional representation in this new government. So, as a compromise, they decided to have one of each, as I'm sure most of you are aware. One of each, so one house in the new legislative body is going to make the large states happy, and that's the House of Representatives, because the number of representatives that each state gets is based on population. And the other is the Senate, and the Senate is going to make the small states happy because everybody's going to get 2, no matter how many people you have. So just to give you an example of how this works out today, California has 53 representatives in the House. Of course, there was no California in 1789 when this went into effect. But today, California has 53 people in the House of Representatives, and Wyoming has just 1. But we both have 2. And this arrangement makes our upper chamber, our Senate, one of the most malapportioned legislative bodies in any of the liberal democracies. It's a pretty extraordinary situation. So, we have 39 million people in California, of course, so that means each of our 2 senators represents almost 20 million people, whereas in Wyoming they have 600,000 people, so they each represent 300,000. So obviously the state of Wyoming has a lot more representation, a lot more influence per capita in the Senate than California does. But it's worth mentioning that at this point, even the House is very malapportioned. So each of our 53 people represents about 765,000 people, I believe, to Wyoming's 600,000. And that's because we capped the number of representatives in the House at the beginning of the 20th century to be 435. So you can't go above that. And the states with large populations end up getting more and more malapportioned, or they get less and less representation as there are more people. Before I leave this, though, I want to mention one more issue that was on the table and very important, and that was the question of slaves when it came to the House, and specifically when you're counting people in determining how many representatives your state is going to have, do slaves count? Of course, the South, which had, in some cases, almost 50% of their population were slaves, the South said, yes, of course, they should count. The North called them on their hypocrisy and said, no, they shouldn't. Give me a break. You don't even think they're people. How can they count for the purposes of population? In the end, as many of you I'm sure know, they did compromise on this, and they came up with what is called the 3/5 compromise, so that one person, one slave would count as 3/5 of a person, or you could think 5 slaves amount to 3 people for the purposes of counting population. Now, this doesn't mean that slaves were going to have a vote or be citizens or anything like that. It just means that when you're counting bodies for the purposes of representation, do you count those? Now, one can certainly ask the question, why did the North end up compromising on this? Why did they compromise? Because clearly their position was pretty sound. This was a pretty hypocritical stance for the South to take. Well, the reason that they compromised was very simple, and that was that the representatives in Philadelphia, they wanted this to pass. And if they had not agreed to count slaves for the purposes of counting population, the South would have ended up with only 35% of the seats in the House. And if they tried to go back to their respective citizens in the South and say, you should vote for this, and they said, well, how is it set up in the legislative branch? And say, well, we only have 1/3 of the seats. They're pretty sure that nobody would have supported it. When they shifted to 45%, which is when they shifted to the 3/5 compromise, what ends up happening is that the percentage of the seats that the South gets goes to 45%. And they were pretty sure that they would be able to sell this to their citizens in the South if they could say that they got 45% of the seats. So that's essentially why we have 2 houses. Now, once they decided this issue of the composition of the okay, so now that they've decided that this new legislative body is going to include 2 houses, and they decide that by the end of May, they turn to questions about how these new legislative offices are going to be elected. And the first topic for discussion is how the House members are going to be elected. The proposal is quickly made that they be directly elected by the people. That's one of the first proposals made. And it's met with a lot of opposition. And one of the things that I want to stress in this discussion is that the delegates in Philadelphia were not there really to empower the average citizen. This was really not an instance of trying to promote direct democracy in any widespread sense. Their understanding of democracy was quite different. So, for instance, when the proposal was made that the House members be directly elected, some of the delegates stood up and said things like, well, we couldn't possibly allow the average citizen to vote because they don't know anything, and they would clearly make mistakes. And other people stood up and said, well, they're so gullible that they'll sell their vote to the highest bidder, and we can't permit that. There were, though, a couple of speeches that were influential in the outcome, which was that they would be directly elected. One was a speech made by Franklin, and he said, well, if we want to think about how our citizens are going to behave if we give them this right, look to our citizen soldiers. He said, we just fought a war against Great Britain, and in that war we saw many British soldiers trying to sell their service to us. but we didn't see any of our soldiers trying to sell their service to the British. Why was that? He said, well, knew they were fighting for themselves. They were fighting on their own behalf. He said, if you treat citizens like citizens, they will behave as citizens. Madison made a speech as well in favor of direct election of the House members, but his was a little bit different. What he said was that if at least one of these offices is not directly elected by the people, then the people will not think of this government as their own. And the long-term survival of this new framework of government was dependent upon the people thinking of it as their own. Now, one thing to point out about this is that it's quite a departure from anything that's gone before. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote, and those representatives in the legislative branch, they were chosen by the state legislatures. So the central government under the Articles was essentially a government comprised of states, right? But what Madison is proposing is that citizens, that the people have representation in the government. People from all the different states have direct representation in the government. This new central government, that was quite unlike anything that had gone before. And it's part of the reason that later, when the Senate, when they turn their attention to the Senate, they decide that the Senate is going to be indirectly selected by the state legislatures, just like it was under the Articles of Confederation. So there's not a direct election. The state legislators chose the senators. When later on, when we revise this to provide for a direct election, and we do that in 1913, many years later, the opposition to that is based on the idea that the states will no longer have representation in the federal government. And so we essentially, in 1913, sort of made the Senate like the House in that it's a representation of people. So it's quite, this idea is quite a new idea in 1787. But this is what they do. So the direct election is confined to the House, and the Senate is going to be indirectly elected, chosen by the state legislators. The attention then turns to the term of office, and now that they have decided that the House is going to be directly elected, there's no way that this is going to be a long term of office. So the argument quickly turns to the sense that, well, if we're going to allow the people to directly elect House members, we need to make sure the term's really short, just in case they make a mistake, so that they can fix it quickly. So 2 years, and they decided on that, I think, at the beginning of June, so very early in the convention. Now, when they turn to the question of the Senate and the term of office of the senators, it's with the understanding that they're going to be indirectly elected, or indirectly chosen by the state legislators. And so there's a sense that the term should be longer, that this is going to be a body in which the people selected are going to have a sort of a longer term outlook. They're not going to be so swayed by local concerns or by short-term considerations. One argument proposal actually is that they be selected for life. Hamilton proposed that. Madison was holding out for 9 years. They eventually settle on 6 years. So that's why the Senate's term is much longer. This is what they talked about at the convention. They next turn to the question of property qualifications. Are the people voting for House members going to have to own property before they can vote? One delegate at the convention, John Adams, argued strenuously that there should be property qualifications, because he argued that, really the only fit citizen is one who owns property. They're the only ones with something at stake. They eventually decided not to put property qualifications in, mostly because they wanted to just to leave it up to the state governments. So a lot of the states at the time already had property qualifications. You couldn't vote unless you owned some property or paid a certain amount of taxes, depending on what state you lived in. So these are some of the issues around the legislative branch. Let me move forward. Okay, now we can, sorry. Find the next slide. Now, another set of issues they had to tackle was what the executive branch would look like and how would they be elected. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive branch, and this was seen as one of the major problems. When they discussed the executive, however, a lot of the attention turned to the executive's role in foreign policy. And the main debate was between whether there would be a chief executive in a single person who might be called a president that was proposed at various points, or whether there would be a council of people. Madison's proposal was for 3 people who together would be the executive power. There were a couple of reasons that they ended up kind of settling on the idea of a single person. One was that in the arena of foreign policy, the model that they had was strong executives, kings, and the idea that one could send a council of people, maybe 3 people walking arm in arm to sit down and meet with the king, seemed ridiculous to some of the people at the convention. And so there was a strong sense that there needed to be a single person who could carry the agenda of the United States in an undivided way to another chief executive. Was one of the reasons they settled on the idea that it would be a single person and not a group of people. Clearly, though, from the writings of people who were at the convention, the decision was also influenced by the presence of George Washington. There was a sense that everybody that was there kind of knew that Washington would be the first one that they would select. And, much of their concern centered around the fear that if they did settle on one person, that person would crown themselves king and sort of take away the electoral power. Now, everybody knew George Washington, and they knew that of all the people on Earth, George Washington would be really the last person to crown himself king. So they could sort of rest assured that wouldn't happen if Washington was in fact selected as the first president. But there were also people there. It was clear that when it came to the question of the term of office, they didn't put anything in there. So they decided on a single person. They did not put any language about the term limit. They decided on 4 years as the term, but they didn't put any language in there about a limit. And some historians have argued that this is partly because some of the delegates thought that when they selected a president, so if they selected Washington, for instance, Washington would serve for the rest of his life. And then when he passed away, they would select someone else who would then in turn serve until they died. And so when Washington stepped down after 2 terms, he was met with a lot of opposition. People said, no, you wait a minute. We didn't intend for you to step down. So they didn't put a term limit in, and there's some suggestion that that's what people had in mind, that they would serve actually for very, very long terms. The other question was how that person would be elected. Now, the convention came back into this many, many times. They had a very hard time coming up with a decision on this. One suggestion was that they be directly elected by the people. That was going nowhere. I mean, if they couldn't even agree that the senators would be going to be directly elected, there was no way that this convention was going to agree that the chief executive would be selected by the people. So another suggestion was that they be selected by Congress, which is the parliamentary model. That was what was already happening in Great Britain. It was what they were familiar with in terms of the prime minister, of course, not the king, but the prime minister. But they said, well, we want to do something different. We don't want to be like Great Britain. So some people suggested maybe that they be selected by the states, just as in the same way that the senators were going to be. But that was met with the criticism that they didn't want this new federal government to be controlled by the states. It was supposed to be controlled by Congress. So they really were having a hard time coming up with any answer to this question. Finally, in September, so they've already been there for more than 3 months, someone suggests something that's called an electoral college. And the electoral college is going to be people that are selected by the state legislatures who would then vote on who the president would be, and if nobody managed to get 50% of all the electors to agree, that the election would move into the House of Representatives and there would be one vote per state. Now, by this time, the delegates were so exhausted. They wanted this to pass, and they wanted to get out of there. They couldn't come up with anything else, and so they agreed. That sounds great. Let's do the Electoral College. Now, as a measure of just how difficult this decision was, they put the language in there. I mean, that paragraph that describes the Electoral College is one of the most convoluted and difficult paragraphs you will ever find. And it's clear that a lot of the delegates didn't really understand it either, because it was actually technically incorrect. It produced a tie, especially in the race of 1800, one of the most contentious elections. The language just did not work. And so they amended the Constitution in 1803 to actually fix the Electoral College language. Now, we still have, of course, the Electoral College. That's how we select the president, but it works very differently than it was understood by the people who wrote it into the Constitution. We haven't amended it or anything like that since the beginning of the 19th century, but it works very different, and I'll talk about that later when we talk about elections. The final set of issues I would like to bring to your attention are those that were involved in the conflict between northern and southern states. It was a very contentious set of issues. They would bring these issues up and then couldn't come to an agreement, table them, come back to them later, couldn't agree, table them. The northern and the southern states were quite different than one another. We're all familiar with that. The North, for instance, made up of merchants, factory owners, of pre-industrial economy. They haven't quite reached the Industrial Revolution. They can't make things as cheaply as Great Britain. They haven't achieved the same economies of scale, but they're on their way, and so they're makers. Now the South, though, is really an agricultural economy. There's some trade, and of course, it's based on a foundation of slave labor. Now, the North comes to the table with certain kinds of demands about the economic powers that Congress is going to have. The North wants Congress to be able to tax imports. Now, why is this important to the North in particular? Well, it's because the North is trying to compete with Great Britain, and if they can tax imports coming from Great Britain, they can make their products relatively more expensive so that people will buy the things that are made in the North. It's a form of protectionism. It's sort of like putting tariffs on or import taxes so that people don't buy things made in China today. They also wanted to make sure that Congress had the ability to dictate that trade into and out of the United States be on U.S.-owned ships. Now, this was what was called the Navigation Acts. It's hard to imagine how important this was back in the day because we don't think of that anymore. But most of the ships were owned by people from the North, and especially people from New York, and it was extremely lucrative if you could get control over whose ships the stuff was going to be traded in. Now, when it came to the economy, the South wanted Congress not to be able to tax exports. They wanted that written into the Constitution, that Congress would not be able to tax exports. Now, similarly, why would the South be so interested in this? Well, it was because they exported a lot of the stuff that they grew and that they also that they found in some cases. They were an export economy, and if Congress taxed the exports that they sent abroad, it would make them more expensive to their customers, and they might lose some market share. And so, between these two, of course, these are very difficult to compromise. There's not much middle ground between these two. And, when they were discussing these things, they were having a hard time finding any kind of compromise. Another set of issues, though, had to do with the slave trade. And some of the delegates from the North wanted to ban the importation of slaves from Africa. And the South, of course, wanted to keep slavery and the importation of slaves. Now, they didn't want Congress to be able to ban those things. Now, the issue of slavery itself, I wrote this here, but the issue of slavery itself was never really on the table. No one ever thought that there could ever be an agreement on a constitution that banned slavery. The South would have clearly have just walked out, would have ended. So it was never, but the issue of importing slaves was pushed at the convention. Now, what happens at the convention is a really good example of lawmaking in general, of the compromise that sometimes is required in order to make progress on laws. And it's a good example also of the analogy, if you've ever heard of law compared to sausage making. You end up with something you kind of like, but you don't really want to see how it's made. Lawmaking is something sometimes like that. And in order to make progress on these seemingly unrelated issues of exports and imports and the slave trade, they had to include all of them. Now, let me just illustrate what I mean. One way that you can think about this is to assign each one of these positions a letter. Let's say that this position here is a big C because it's a strong it's a strong trade position. It gives Congress a lot of power. So we're going to call this a big C. And we're going to call this one over here a little c. Fairly weak power. Congress doesn't have very much power over commerce. Now this one we're going to call a small s because it's going to weaken slavery. This one we're going to call a big S. The position is to have a strong position on slavery. And when you're understanding how this ends up happening, you can analyze this decision making by using a simple model. Let's ask the question, let's assume that instead of deciding these separately, are we going to tax imports or not tax exports, let's assume that we're going to do it together and we're going to have a pair of preferences. And we can ask the question, for the North, what is their top preference? In terms of a commerce position and a slave position, what would their top preference be? Well, the top combination for the South, the most preferred policy combination, is a big C and a little s, right? And then you can move to their second position, because what we're doing in negotiation is we're trying to find areas of agreement, right? Their second most preferred policy position, again, is with a big C, but paired with a big S. Because the North would really, they would rather, imports are much more important. So they're willing, so the big S is their second preferred. And then when you move to the third, then you have to move to little c, right? Little c paired with a little s. And then their least preferred policy combination, a little c and a big S, right? And you can do the same thing for the South, right? What is their number one policy preference? Well, hopefully you've seen that it's a little c and a big S. So for the South, keeping slavery and the slave trade is much more important than anything else on the table. And you might notice right off the bat, that is the opposite, right? That's the least preferred policy combination for the North. So no wonder they're having such a hard time coming to an agreement. All right, let's then look at their second preference. Well, for the South, the second preference is a big C and a little s, a big C and a big S. Slavery, again, most important. And so they would, so the big C is paired with that most important preference. And you'll notice, of course, this is where the area of agreement is. Now, like I said, on these issues, they had been going back and forth for months on these questions, considering them separately. Economy one day, maybe a couple days later, the slave trade, and then go back to economy. But there was a moment in August, in the third week in August, when there's an important exchange that takes place when someone from the North notices that the Virginia delegation is actually arguing with people from South Carolina and Georgia. And people from South Carolina and Georgia are saying, well, it's all well and good for you, Virginia, to give up the slave trade. We have swamps, and our slaves die in the swamps, and so we have to import slaves. But yours managed to survive, and so we'll end up having to purchase slaves from you, which we don't want to do. Now, somebody from the North picked up on that and said, oh, I didn't realize how hard it was for you, South Carolina and Georgia. Maybe we need to reconsider this opposition to the slave trade, the importation of slaves. Now, with that little give to or expression of empathy from the North to the South, there was a moment when this people from the South said, "Oh, the people from the North, maybe they understand us," and the governor of Pennsylvania at that moment says, "Oh, well, maybe these things may form the basis of a bargain among us," and they take it and send it to a committee and come back with an agreement. Now, what Governor Morris from Pennsylvania might have realized is precisely this possibility of moving to their second choice. Both parties moving to their second preferred policy combination as a way to move things ahead. It was almost as if Governor Morris had a light bulb go off in his head. So they went off and sent it to a committee, and the committee came back and proposed giving Congress the ability to tax imports at the same time that the slave trade would be kept in to the agreement. Now, it didn't end there, so that represents, of course, this position here. But it didn't end there. Once this agreement was reached, there was a kind of almost like a spirit of mutual camaraderie or something like that, and there was an agreement that, well, if also if we agree to prohibit Congress from taxing exports, that South Carolina and Georgia will, with Virginia, try to figure out a way to make it not so onerous on South Carolina and Georgia to have to import slaves, and maybe drain the swamps, or figure out a trade agreement between Virginia and now South Carolina and North and Georgia. And they agreed, okay, as long as you agree that Congress will not have the ability to tax exports, we'll agree that in 1808 Congress can ban the importation of slaves, and we'll write that in. It was almost like, for the delegates there, it was almost like Christmas, because they ended up getting this as well, which is the third policy preference, the small c, no taxing of exports, that goes in there as well. And so does, in some means, the banning of the slave trade. I don't know who came up with the idea of 1808, right? But putting that date in there and saying, well, we won't ban it now, but we'll agree that Congress can ban it in 1808, moved everything forward. So that sort of all four of these positions ended up being in the final bill. I mean, in the final Congress, in Constitution. This is the way lawmaking often happens. So, for instance, people criticize Congress sometimes, and they say, well, why are these unrelated things in this bill? And it betrays kind of a naivete about the way the lawmaking process happens. Lawmaking is almost never a situation in which there is one policy on the table, both sides come, they debate it, they come to some kind of an agreement, everybody is in consensus about it, and then the law is passed about that one issue. Much more often, in order for an agreement to take place and for a law to be passed, there's a negotiation among issues that are somewhat unrelated. And this is a facet of lawmaking that's crucial to the success quite often. And we'll later in the semester look at some other examples of this. So I want to just point this out. So make sure that you know what ended up going into the Constitution and have some idea about why that is. All right.